Welcome to part 5 of my Regal Blush Transparent Watercolor Paint Along. This is the second narrated tutorial for this paint along. There's a lot of similarities in the two paintings I do for the tutorials in this paint along. I take the same approach with each of them, and they have similar compositions with a different placement of some of the larger shapes. So I'm beginning the same way. I'm drawing some major shapes, but because I develop the painting much as I go and I let the paint flow around the paper and make decisions based on some of that activity, the end result is going to be quite different. I've sketched in the major floral shapes and have sketched lightly a number of the leaf shapes to indicate where that activity is going to be at. And you can see, obviously, none of this is very detailed. With my sketch done, I'm ready to begin applying paint. And these two paintings in this series are very similar, and they use the same colors that were used in the exercise. Similar compositions, a little change of direction and size and positioning, but there's going to be a consistency between the two paintings. And the subject's the same, colors are the same, but the arrangement's going to be different, and they're going to follow the same process, but they're going to get two different results because I develop these as I go. And you can see here that I've applied this combination of quinacridone and coral with a little bit of royal blue in it, and then I'm going to go ahead and take some green. This is a sap green, and then I'm going to, after applying some of the pigment around the paper, I'm going to take my fine mist sprayer and I'm going to diffuse that color again away from some of the edges. So here again I'm starting to define my larger shapes. I decided to do two paintings for this paint along just so I can go through the process twice on top of the exercise, just to reinforce the process that I'm using and the approach that I take. Because it's not as obvious as following a reference photo and creating a painting, I decided to do two paintings for this tutorial, or for this paint along, to reinforce the process I'm going through and the mental approach that I take to it, because I think that can be harder to grasp than watching somebody just paint to a reference photo. As you can see, once I've dried the paper, the wash is lightened up quite a bit. So I'm coming back now and I'm going to start building my layers on top of what I call the foundation layer of the foundation wash that I've put down. I'm beginning to apply some small valued brush marks to help define where some of these larger floral elements are and start to give some definition to the leaf shapes that I have coming from the edge of the floral elements. And I've got this dark mixture of sap green, royal blue with a touch of pyro red. I'm continuing with these dark marks. I've put some down towards the right side, in the middle of the composition. Now I'm working to give some definition to some of these edges on the left side, and I'm spraying them away from the edge to diffuse that color. So you can see where I've applied the green and softened it up with the spray bottle, but I still have some hard edge left on the side of the floral elements and some of the edges of the leaves. Here you can see that I'm continuing making the small valued brush marks to define these shapes, but I've switched over to a red tone. And as I mentioned, I use this foundation wash sometimes as a color roadmap, and you can see how I'm changing colors. Even though my values are very similar, I'm switching colors and matching them up somewhat with the initial wash that I put down to start. I don't always follow 100%, but it's a good guide for me to follow to maintain some consistency in my overall design and keep a dominance where I want the dominance in terms of color. Now I've thoroughly dried my paper and I switched back to a dark valued green tone that I'm working with. And when I'm working and building up these layers, I normally am at a point where I apply one color and then I dry my paper, then I'll go back to the other. And in this case, I'm not using a lot of different colors. I just pretty much the green and the red. And I'm not doing a lot of mingling wet and wet at this point. I did that towards the beginning, but I want to keep my layers fresh and clean. So I don't do a lot of mingling of pigment on the paper at this point. Now I do in some of my other paintings when I'm doing a landscape. Let's say if I'm painting a tree or something, I like to do a lot of charging of color, but it's a different subject and a different approach. But here I'm just trying to build up these nice clean layers of glaze and keep these very nice bright whites and lights and keep them just clean and fresh. Now I'm working with a dark green tone to give a little bit more definition to the edges of some of these leaf shapes that I have. And I still I'm at a point where I'm using the spray bottle to diffuse that color. You can see how it creates a flow from the top right corner more down towards the left, just because of the direction of those diffused washes and the layers that I've been building up. And you get that effect when you put that tone on an edge and spray it away. I think it gives a nice feeling of direction as you continue to work and build those layers up. At this point it's dried and everything still has quite a bit of a softness of a feel to it. And now I'm going to start bringing in a little bit more detail. I've got a dark value green and I'm using this quill brush that I like to use. It's got a nice sharp point on it and making some nice crisp marks. And I'm working around the outer edges of these larger shapes, and it starts to build depth behind them and starts to suggest overlap. And it's a process that I'm going to continue through my whole painting process with this piece. As I put these down, you can tell it doesn't take much of a mark at all to help define an edge. Just the slightest little mark or a couple marks helps to define an edge and differentiate it from another shape or another area or the background. These are very small marks that I've made, but you can see some of the depth that it starts to bring to the painting and how much it further defines some of these larger shapes. Just by putting just a little mark here or there, it can really have an impact. And one of the big reasons it does is there's a nice contrast of value. If those were just soft marks with very little value change, it really wouldn't have that kind of an impact. I want to start to set some of the background area, some of the negative space back a little farther, and I want to have a little bit more impact with the red tone. So I'm applying a top wash over top of some of the areas I've already painted and diffusing that color away from the edges. So that starts to bring those floral elements forward even more and starts to tie some of the background area together, and eventually here it's going to start to feel like it's further and further in the back behind these floral elements. I want to start giving some definition to these floral elements that I have. So I'm going to be using the same approach that I used in the first of the 3 exercises that were done in part 2 of this paint along. I'm putting down some of these medium dark red value tones and just giving the indication of where that center of the flower is going to be, then diffuse that color. And so I'll get that glazing effect, and it's going to vary as it flows, and I'm still going to have kind of that shadowed mark that I initially put down that didn't wash away completely. So the same thing here, hit it with water, let that flow. I'm going to continue this process on these other floral elements, making some marks. Then I hit it with some water and diffuse that color, but I still retain some of those initial marks. I think this is one of the things that's hard for people, is to, whether it's using a spray bottle or just a wet brush and gradating a washout, letting that paint just flow over the top of some of the things you've already worked on. But you still have time, if you don't like it, to lift it normally or spray it off. And but letting that paint flow and letting gravity do what it does is kind of the uniqueness to watercolor for me. When I do a painting like this, it's part me and it's part gravity. There's areas in this painting that my paintbrush will never touch. There's times when I just let the paint flow, I dry it, and I'll leave it alone, and that's how it'll stay for the painting. I don't render every square inch of my painting, and I think that's one of the beauties of watercolor that sometimes gets missed. We want to take a brush and touch every square inch of the surface, and you don't need to with watercolor. You working with gravity, if you set up properly, work at an incline, you're in control. Even though it's fluid and it's flowing, you still have an idea. You know where that bead is going. You know where your paper's wet. You know where your paper's dry. And but let gravity have a chance and let it work with the medium to see what it can do. So at this point, I've advanced forward some, and I've done quite a bit of brush work with the leaves and working in the green areas that I've defined in my composition. And now I'm taking some of this very dark red tone and are starting to sharpen up the edges on some of these shapes. So it doesn't take much, just a little mark here and there to give the suggestion that there's an edge and build a little rigidity into the shapes. When I do a painting like this, I don't treat every area of my composition the same. I think sometimes people do paintings and every inch looks like every other inch in the painting in terms of detail value, how much brushwork they've done. When I do a painting like this, I want to leave some areas up to the viewer's eye. I want to give some areas to rest. And there's areas where I'm just going to let, as I said, let gravity do its work. And I might never touch it with a brush. But there's a nice effect that's been created by the fluidity of the medium, and I don't need to. So I don't feel the need to overbrush and over detail. And I think that can be a challenge sometimes, because we tend to want to touch every inch of the paper with our brush, and we want to detail everything out, and we don't really want to give the eye a place to rest, or we don't want to leave some things up to the imagination. And I think that's part of the challenge, is holding back, not trying to render everything. But you do want crispness in some areas. You do want definition. You want to be able to tell what it is. So it's not totally abstract, but for me, it's somewhere in the middle there of what's real and what's design and what's abstraction. But I think that's what keeps it interesting. Here I've done a lot of brush work, especially in the negative space. And I've done a lot to build my values and push back some of these areas in negative space and bring some of these positive floral elements forward. one thing I just want to touch on again is to think about process. For me, I start with the large shapes, start with the lighter values, and I work towards smaller shapes with darker values. And I start to go from loose to tighter. I'm more deliberate with my brush marks. Here I'm putting very dark valued shapes down, but they're very deliberate. They're hard edged, so there's less soft edge painting I'm doing at this point. And there's plenty of areas in the painting right now that I never touched with a brush, and I won't through the completion of this painting. But there's other areas where I've done a lot of brush work, and I'm going to continue to build layers in those areas. So some of these areas which have just a light wash that's occurred by the pigment flowing with gravity and then dried and left alone, and then some of these other areas where I've been building up layer upon layer of shapes and values, there are many layers. So I'm not treating everything the same, but I'm following my process, and I start to get to that point where I've got my smaller shapes, I've got my darker values, I've defined my subject and my center of interest, and I know I'm getting close to finishing my painting just because of the design of my painting process. And there's a lot of repetition with my process here. It takes a little bit of patience and to build these layers little by little and develop the whole composition as one unit. I don't just go into the one area and just finish it and then move on across my paper. I just keep building the whole composition as I go. So I've done a lot more brush work here, still doing some with the dark green value. And this gradual buildup, I think, really makes this look very complex. And it's really just an assemblage of shapes. It's not as intricate as I think at first as it comes across. It's not that it's so simple that it's just a few brush strokes, but it's, as I've said before, if you can do the exercise and the elements of the exercise, you have what it takes to do the painting. It's just more of the exercise. And I know I make it sound easy, and it's not always, and there's times when things don't turn out like you want, but it's just this sticking with it, staying with your process, and developing your composition, and then it comes together. I want to have a little bit more definition and contrast in these floral elements that I have. There's not a lot of detail, and I'm still going to soften and diffuse some of that color. As I continue to build up my layers here, I mentioned it takes a little bit of patience, and there's a lot of layers that I build up here, and you have to be diligent and take the time to stop and dry the paper, which I do frequently. But this is a quarter sheet watercolor, and a piece like this normally doesn't take me much more than 2 hours. And the video is much shorter than that, obviously, because I do some editing. I take the hair drying, the drying of the paper with a hair dryer out, and some of the repetitive little detail brushwork, such as I'm doing right here. I don't show all of it because it gets very monotonous, but I step things along. But it's really not that long in terms of a commitment of time. For me, I feel the way I work, because I follow my process and move things right along. And like I said, it's probably about 2 hours to do a piece like this. The one thing that can happen as I do a lot of this brush work is some segments can become a bit fragmented. And what I'll do towards the latter part of my process sometimes is I'll come in with a flat type wash glaze of a color to put over an area and help bring it together, and it starts to form more of a larger shape. But it's still, you don't lose all the brushwork that you've done underneath it if you're just using a light to middle value glaze on it. And again, to me, it helps it starts to tie areas together, and it also starts to push some of the areas back in terms of depth, because there's less detail, less definition of the edges, because the values are closer within that shape. But to me, it unifies the composition, areas of the composition. You have to be smart about what you're using to put on top of other colors. And with a limited palette such as I'm using here, it's not as complex an issue. But if you're working with a painting that's got a lot of different colors, a lot of variation of color going on, and if you're trying to maintain a certain freshness or intensity of a color, you want to make sure you don't glaze over it with say a complement that's just going to deaden the color, and it may negatively impact what you're trying to do. So you have to be smart when you're putting a glaze over like that. But when you're working on something that's a limited palette like this, and you're just putting another wash, a glaze that's basically the same color as what you've been working in, you're not going to get that deadening of color, but you're going to get that unity and tie some of that those pieces together so they're not as fragmented. I'm going to use some of that same glazing technique with a red tone here, and this is using quinacridone and coral, pretty much straight from the palette, and it has a nice bit of color intensity, and I like to use it because while it tones down an area and ties it together, it also has a nice intensity of color that kind of draws the eye into it. When I'm doing some glazing in the later part of my process, as I'm doing here, I get some of the same directional impact that I have early in my painting when I put down a tone and hit it with a spray bottle. And I probably should be using a bigger brush for what I'm doing right here, because I'm having to make a bunch of little strokes, and I could have just put a couple brush strokes down with a larger brush. But bringing in that spray bottle and spraying it away from those edges in a consistent direction just starts to bring that motion into the overall composition and reinforce it. And I can get some of that in the later stages of my process by doing some of this glazing that I do with a color such as this quinacridone and coral. And here again, I'm kind of sticking to my color roadmap where I'm putting the red over the red and the green over the green. Now I'm at the point where I want to do some lifting and drag some of that pigment from the dark areas into some of the lighter areas. So I have this dampened nylon flat brush that I'm doing that with. And I just try and pull some of that pigment out of the dark area and drag it into the light area. You can see the mark it makes. And the other thing that the impact I try and get with this is, as I drag some of that color, I try and cover some of these floral shapes in some areas to create a little overlap, so they're not just feeling like they're cut out and stuck on there. They feel more like they're part of the composition, because there's not a lot of detail in them, but I don't want them to feel like they're just cut out and stuck on there. So you can see that mark I just made, how it overlaps that flower, now helps push that flower back a little bit and give the suggestion of that kind of graspy wisp of green is covering it and is in front of it in the foreground. And same here with what I'm doing. So I constantly look for opportunities to create overlap and give the perception of depth in my painting. Now I'm at a point where I'm putting down some of these small dark valued brush marks to help sharpen up some of the edges and really create some little pockets of depth in the painting. And this is just like I did in my other painting, the same thing. And the thing to keep in mind that I keep stressing is I'm not being driven here to put these marks because of my reference material. I'm doing it because of the composition and the design I'm trying to achieve, but also I'm being driven by my process. This is the exact same point in my other painting that I reached a point where I decided it was time to start sharpening it up, put some of the darker values in there, and start detailing the painting. So it's just where I'm at in my process, and that's why I'm doing it. So again, I follow a process, and I know as I get towards the end of all my steps that I'm close to finishing my painting. And just because I've reached the end of my process doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be happy with my painting. There's times when I get to the end and I finish a painting, I'm not necessarily happy with the results I got. But the approach I take is that if it's a success, it's something I'm going to build on. And if it's something I'm not necessarily happy with, it's something I'm going to learn from. I try to learn from every painting, from every brushstroke. And I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty much exhausted my process. Continuing to paint isn't going to improve it and make me like it. I've either got a success or not at that point, the way I look at it. Now, sometimes I might set a painting aside because I kind of get stuck on it, and I decide just to put it aside and come back to it, and then I'll have a fresh new start. But at that point, I'm probably not through the end of my process either. In the introduction of this paint-along, I mentioned the development objectives for this paint-along. And the first one was to paint with a plan, and that's where I'm talking about my process and following a plan all the way through. So that's an area that I hope that I've got that message out there, and it may not work for you, but this is the approach that I take. The other thing was to develop negative space, and that's what the majority of my painting has been in both of these pieces, is working primarily in negative space. The other thing was to say more with less, and this is where, as I just make some of these small marks and suggest edges and underdevelop these floral shapes, that's where I'm talking about saying more with less and letting the viewer figure some of it out. The other thing was a variety of edges, and I have a lot of different edges in here. I have lost and found edges, I have soft edges, I have hard edges, and so I've tried to stress that throughout both paintings. And the last objective was gradation of color, and you can see that I've got a gradation of color going from green to red and from light to dark valued within a color. So I've used that throughout both the exercise and both of these paintings. Here I'm going to finish up this painting by putting some of these overlapping linear marks that I'm putting down by using a liner brush with a dark value paint. In this case, it's the green tone. And I'm just doing some of the same things that I do when I lift, where I'm trying to suggest a little bit of motion and create pockets of overlap. And as I've mentioned in some of my other videos, I normally, as I make some of these marks, I start and I lift, then I put it back down and interrupt the line so that it looks like it's going over and under various shapes. And that concludes this painting and part 5 of this paint along. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope this reinforces some of the areas that I covered in my first painting and in the skills exercises. If you ever have questions about the materials I'm using, you can always go to the studio page on my website, rsurwitzart.com, where I have all my materials listed. And if you have a specific question, you can email me at contact@rsurwitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.